Good morning, everyone. Welcome to JamFactory's Wednesday talk. Firstly, JamFactory acknowledges that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land and acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. We extend that respect to other Aboriginal language groups and to other First Nations people joining us today. Today we have a Wednesday talk by Peter Walker. Peter is a South Australian visual artist, furniture designer, surfboard builder and esteemed educator at the University of South Australia. He also served as the director of JamFactory's furniture studio from 1997 to 2000. In his practice, Peter encourages his audience to reflect on the nature of timber and its origins. Peter's solo exhibition, Tanglewood, is currently on display in JamFactory's Gallery 1. It features a series of three-dimensional works that combine sculptural composition with elements of design to explore the inherent abstract qualities of timber.
Great, thanks Caitlin. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Kaurna people that we're meeting on today. Thinking about how to sort of frame this talk and thinking about the type of people that might be in the audience, I was thinking, well, really a lot of people here will be from the JamFactory and potentially some from the university. And many of us are, pursuing our creative pursuits independently. It's quite an individual undertaking often, and yet there's these moments where you come together and share ideas, and it can be quite a collaborative process as well. So this is an image that I've shared a lot in the past, and it's a place called the Singing Wells in Kenya. And it's, I just love this image as far as it encapsulates all the things that I'm interested in as far as art and craft and design and cultures. And so you can see the way that these people have actually created a ladder structure down into the well to gather the water. They're using giraffe hide, the materials at hand to actually create the buckets. They're working as a team to get the water from the bottom of the well up to the top, and they're singing all the time, which we can't hear, but I just love that notion that this is, you can sort of sense the echoes and what's taking place. I have been teaching both at the University of South Australia and at RISD in the States, and at the JamFactory for a long time, since the late 90s. And so my practice has sort of involved not only my own undertakings in the studio, but also the whole notion and the process of teaching. And just thinking about that first image, some of the projects I've undertaken have often begun with various kind of processes to begin with. So that was a project undertaken in 2020 between the Rhode Island School of Design, the University of South Australia and the Botanic Gardens. And it's called the Witness Tree, which has been something that's been running in the States for over a decade. And essentially it looks at what trees have witnessed. And we focused this particular course around what the trees have witnessed in Adelaide, since colonisation. And Uncle Mugi Sumner performed the starting of that particular 3-week intensive course with a smoking ceremony and then teaching us the dancing that would take place. Another project was undertaken in about 2012 called the Fiji Canoe Project. And it was looking at sustainable sea transport, and we took students to Fiji there and were ensconced in a sailor's village, and one of the ways that we would start each day was with a kava ceremony and a singing ceremony. And another project I'd like to touch on before I get into the sort of studio work is that in about 2009, Toshiba, the giant consumer electrical company, approached RISD, where I was working at the time, with an idea that they would like us to consider things going forward for them as a design company, which is enormous. At the time, they had about 200,000 employees. They've been going since 1875, and they have done, once you look into the Toshiba history, they have been remarkable in what they've delivered to us on a technological front, from the first laptops and rice cookers, nuclear power. Really quite an extraordinary company. And they came to an art and design school wanting us to think about notions of memory and emotion and how this might impact them going forward. And this started in Japan. We went to Tokyo and started with a ceremony in a temple, and then going through the Toshiba Museum to be introduced to the history of this company and what they've actually done. And really interestingly, right back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they were doing all sorts of experimental things with mechanical figurines, mechanical robots, perpetual clocks, really kind of out there ideas that were a long way from what their consumer market was interested in or about, but they really invested in the idea of just creative thinking. So we had a number of students who went through a huge range of ideas, from new keypad sounds that might, encourage emotional responses, to, a range of technological and digital ways that Toshiba might incorporate design into their design thinking in their future. And the one that they were most interested in was that this student, Antonio Miaggio, actually created some short films on the way that balloons were tied together, and thinking about whether it's strict, stiff kind of connectors or flexible connectors, whether they're in 2s or 3s or 4s, however it is. And then he made films of these behaving in the wind. And Toshiba came back to us saying this was actually, out of all the different ideas, this was the one that was most interesting, because as a kind of a major international corporate company, they were really interested in how this might work as a business model. So it's fascinating to me that from an art and design kind of focus and the way that we think creatively in our studios, that this can then be applied by somebody else who comes on, enjoys that idea and sort of runs with it. So it's not really about coming up with the solution of a design solution for that industry. It's more about how they think. As Caitlin mentioned, I was the head of the furniture studio here in the late 90s. This was one of the first commissions we did, between the metal studio and the furniture studio, for a hair salon furniture. And this was the last commission, really major commission we undertook, which was the Padare Christian College, of seating for 900, working with Phillips Pilkington Architecture. So just the range and scope of the types of things we were doing at the time, and all the time also everyone developing their own individual design futures. That was kind of a high pressure, as any studio head here would be able to appreciate. You're working with budgets that you need to meet and training people, and all sorts of things are beyond your control. And I tended to work at the same time in the opposite way in my own work, and this one of these large braces on the jetty beam came off in a storm and washed up on the beach, which I went back and scavenged. It was about 6 metres long, about 3 metres of it stuck out the back of the van. The kids and I all grabbed it in the night and took it, and I wasn't really sure if we'd stolen it or if we'd just found it like you do on the beach. Unfortunately, when it was exhibited at the JamFactory, the Minister for the Arts at the time was also the Minister for Transport, Diana Laidlaw, and she purchased the work, so that kind of legitimised it for me. She kept it in her collection for about 20 years and then has downsized where she was living, and has now donated it back to the city of Charles Sturt. So it's now back at the Grange Beach where it came from. So there's this kind of nice loop there that happens. But it really got me interested too in the whole kind of the structures of jetties all around the South Australian coast, which are quite rare on the Australian coastline because we have the protected waters by Kangaroo Island. Most of the rest of the eastern seaboard and western seaboard doesn't have that protection, so jetties don't last long. This created my first solo show at the JamFactory in 2000, which I just kept going with that idea, and I was really interested in utilising found materials that had a previous industrial life. So these were quite large objects, most of them 2 to 3 metres in length and quite massive in their sort of volume and weight. And they all related to particular locations around South Australia. What am I doing there? This is Jepp's Cross, for example. I'd just like to flick through these. This one is an interesting, when the jetties are built, the pylons are driven down into the seabed, and they have a cast iron cone on their nose to sort of ram them into the bottom of the earth, ocean floor. And it's the same technology that the Romans were using in building bridges. So I love this sense that even with all this passage of time and intelligence and developments in technology, there's still these kind of primitive methods that are really based in the nature of the material itself. And these were kind of incongruous, really large, sort of 600 square diameter, very long beams that were so weighty and floating on glass panels and, rudders and paddles that took you around in circles, basically. So that was the first sort of solo show at the Jam, and it was straight after that finished, I actually departed for the United States, where I'd been offered a 1-year sabbatical replacement position at the University of Wisconsin. And during my time there, the position at RISD had come up, and I applied for that and got it. So I ended up going back and spending 10 years at RISD, which was really a remarkable experience. One of the projects, while I was there, this is from the dorms at the RISD campus, looking down at the RISD campus, which is in Providence, about 3 hours north of New York, about an hour south of Boston. And the furniture department was housed in that brick building on the right with the domed tower at the top. So Roseanne Summerson, who was the head of the furniture department at the time, John Dunnigan and myself, we formed a design company called Chiswell Furniture. And when they were refurbishing the dorms, because in the States, students tend to leave school, high school, they'll go to a college and then they live in their dormitories, and it's quite a different culture to what takes place here. But the dorms are really a big part of student life. And so we were put forward a proposal to design the furniture for this 500-room dormitory that was being refurbished, and we felt, as we were all teaching in the furniture department, we felt it was really important that we could lead by example and use this as a teaching tool, basically. And one of the first things we did was just select a palette of materials that we felt passionate about. This was the early 2000s. And we were very keen to promote a sustainable way of going forward. So we had bamboo, Valchromat, which is at the time was a new form of MDF that had non-toxic binders and colour that would go all the way through it. And the beech came from certified forests. So this bed, the flip bed, is actually, we were designing for really cramped spaces. And so this bed had two options. Just by turning the bed upside down, you had one that was higher and one was lower, could have storage underneath. One of the prerequisites was that they didn't want lots of things that came apart, because all the parts would end up in students' artwork. And then, just simple things like solid bases under the mattresses so that they could store large works, canvases, papers, whatever. We could also say, go home and sleep on your idea, and that worked. And then desks, this was prior to wireless, so that you had to have a lot of accommodation for cables. The chair itself was designed with medical specialists, and we were looking at the way that if you have a concave seat, it actually sort of closes your pelvic bones and muscles, and if it's convex like that, it opens it up. So as far as keeping you alert for doing work and study, it's a better way of actually activating the chemicals throughout your spine. It's not super comfortable for a long time, so yeah, it's an interesting idea. I'm not sure it's great. And laptop, shelf underneath, those sorts of things. Dining tables. It went on into chests of drawers and other things. And then this, I'd also been involved prior to coming to the JamFactory with trying to get Australian furniture manufacturers interested in Australian designers. And it was always seemed to be a bit of a struggle. This is like the 80s and 90s to get people to actually put money and invest in design thinking. So it was a really fantastic relief to get to RISD, and it worked the other way around, where the manufacturers actually pitched to us as the designers at RISD as why they should be able to manufacture it. So it was this complete turnaround to the culture that was happening here. It was also important to us we had local manufacturers. We really didn't want to get into freighting and transporting. There were soft furnishings as well. And there's a couple of shots of just promotional shots of how it would work in the dorm conditions. While I'm just talking about furniture, this is a more recent furniture design undertaking, which was 2 or 3 years ago. The JamFactory and the uni came together for the Adelaide Modern exhibition, where we were paired with mid-century modern manufacturers and asked us to think about redesigning or be inspired by those kind of aesthetics at the time. My process is that I will make lots of scale models. The piece of furniture itself, obviously a chair is like the most challenging thing you'll ever design. It's something that engineering, structure, its weight, its movability, its comfort, its aesthetic, it's used probably only 40% of its life at most. Most of the time it's unused, but it has a presence in wherever your space is. So I'm also interested in that sort of presence that extends beyond the chair itself. So just the process of making various models and then transitioning from scale models up into full-scale prototypes, getting various models to test it out, sit on it. Every body is different, so there is no ideal chair. And that was the final solution for those, which were, I didn't actually mention this, but the whole point of this chair was to increase your ability to hear in a noisy restaurant and cafe. So the idea of these echo panel wings up the side, that they were designed to sort of bounce the back chat back from other tables and also be angled directly across from whoever you're speaking to so that it bounces into your ears. And these do work, which I'm pleased to say. The second exhibition I had at the JamFactory was a really immersion in surfboard design making culture for quite a long time. This was in 2010 was the exhibition, but these early shots were about 2002 or 3, and the surfboard industry used to be monopolised by a foam blank manufacturer called Grubby Clark. And he went bust in about 2002, and it suddenly made this huge shift in what had been a monopoly of that industry, and it really started people thinking about other ways of making surfboards. It also coincided for me that I'd been in San Diego visiting a mutual friend who knew Dale Veltzi, who was a very famous figure in the surf culture history. And he was building wooden surfboards again, which he'd done in the 1940s. And I had spent some time in his studio with him, and I just got so inspired and excited. Next time we went back about a year later, he'd actually died. This was his paddle out funeral service, which again was a really moving experience. And it was just, I'd enjoyed surfing since I was a teenager, and I had obviously been making wooden objects for a while, so it was a kind of a nice coming together, thinking I'd really love to start making wooden boards. So the history of surfing really grabbed me as well. This is Tom Blake, an American, who really is quite responsible for the reinvention of surfing in Hawaii. After Captain Cook went through there in the 1770s, the surfing was banned in Hawaii after that. That, you know, people were naked, men and women surfing together, having too much fun. The pilgrims came in and said, no, this can't happen, not allowed to do that anymore. So it was actually squeezed out of their culture, and it wasn't until the early 1900s that Tom Blake, as an American, went back and really helped reinvigorate surfing within Hawaii. And he was quite a phenomenal designer. He was the first person to place a fin on a surfboard. And I like this idea of how long it takes things to evolve, design ideas, how long it takes us to understand what we're looking at and how we might improve things. That top image is the fin in 1935, and it wasn't until 1981 that Simon Anderson developed the thruster, which is the three fins at the bottom, and this is still the absolute doyen of all surfing fins currently. Tom Blake also looked at this, the idea of the hollow surfboard, because the traditional Hawaiian koa boards weighed, like 100 pounds, and so he sort of based his designs on the aeroplane wings. He's also early experiments into windsurfing. You can see from the top, that was in the 1931. Then by 37, he'd sort of developed the sail, and it wasn't really until 1964 that Naomi Darby was responsible for developing the first commercial windsurfers. So my first forays into making surfboards were pretty clumsy, but I loved doing it, and they were solid boards at that point. And this was a solid balsa wood board with Stephen Bowers as the artist who illustrated it. And it wouldn't be a great board in the water, but it actually ended up in the Parliament House art collection with the shot on the right of the Eternity, and there's a few references to Tampa Bay, and so where that's positioned in Parliament House is that side's to the wall and the other side faces out. But that might have changed since Albanese got in, I don't know. This is developing the hollow frames for the boards. I've always made them by hand. I really enjoy making things by hand. It would make a lot more sense to do things, get laser cut components. There'd be many ways to sort of speed up production, but I'm not really, that's not been my focus. Trees grow slowly, and I work slowly. That, we're connected in that sense. What it did give me was a lot of opportunity to think about the surfaces of the boards and how it might be treated. And some of those experiments with fire, some with inlay, making parquetry kind of blocks that scrapped out of the workshop, which could then get inlaid into the surface. And this was an experiment with drawing with veneer, so using a jeweler's Dremel and actually just drawing freehand into the surface of the wood and then being able to tap the veneer on its edge into those lines. Because most veneer work is governed by strict lines, strict geometries, the tools we have. So I was really interested in how I could start to incorporate this looser kind of drawing notion into that type of work. I've always, I haven't always, I did go through a period of time where I didn't photograph my work and I regret it, and it was just due to financial constraints at the time. But I did learn that you really, if you don't photograph it, it's almost like it doesn't exist. It continues to disappear. So I've had a good working relationship with Grant Hancock for many years, and for me, he's a great photographer. He really has a beautiful sense of composition. He's got an eye for detail, and he sees things in my work that I don't see. So I think everyone has to find their own photographers, because people work better for certain people, but Grant is really valuable to my practice. And these were shots developed by Grant that went into the catalogue for the Making Waves exhibition, which was in 2010. Some of these boards are done with other artists, and again, I appreciate and enjoy that collaborative process as well. They're all designed to be surfed. Some of them get surfed, some don't. It's just the way it is. This is a work with Stephen Bowers, and you can see, kind of get that sense of his close detail that he works onto the timber. It's just using the burnt coals that you saw in an earlier photograph to heat the wood and catch it before it actually burns through that deck. The decks are only about 6 mils thick. They're quite thin, made of paulownia, which is a really light, very lightweight timber. It's also known as coffin wood, and it's very suitable for maritime purposes. This is a work with Jerry Wedd, and Jerry looked at the structure of paulownia under the microscope to develop this idea of how he would actually sort of paint onto the surface with ink that bled into the wood. And this was with Quentin Gore, who it was a 1970s design. Each of the boards in that show directly referenced a particular type of period within surfboard history and development. And that's that earlier inlay shot and what's called a finless double ender, that surfboard. More examples of the burning. The burning is really exciting process. It takes a long time to build a surfboard, and then to put it in the fire has certain risks. And it also has one of those nice processes where you don't really know what the result's going to be exactly. So I enjoy that. And this was a work with Phil Hayes, who at the time was the design director for Quicksilver and living in Asia. The story behind this board is called the swastika, and in the 1930s there was a building company in California called Swastika that started developing these boards as a commercial product, and then when the Second World War broke out and Hitler appropriated the swastika, they went bust. It was just this incredible collapse of that industry for them. And this is called a Bonza, this surfboard. It's one of the most complex designed surfboards in the history of board design, and there's actually double sets of concave on the bottom. There's a lot of hydrodynamics and physics that are involved in how water flows around that particular board. It was never produced a great deal because of the expense involved in it, but it was a beautiful thing to make a wooden version of that. And that's the examples of the drawing with veneer in that surface, how that came out. I think just also when you're having exhibitions, solo exhibitions, there's so many other people involved, and this is a big thank you really for the JamFactory and everyone else who does get involved in an undertaking, because it's, while you as the artist or designer might get a lot of focus, there's invariably a vast team of people behind it that have helped make it happen. This was a brochure catalogue that went with the exhibition, and then this is a team in the gallery figuring out how to install these boards. I was really pedantic about the boards were such pristine sculptural forms. I didn't want anything to encumber them as far as a stand or brackets or anything like that, so we figured out a system whereby there was an elastic cord underneath in the box at the plinth at the bottom that's attached to the surfboard. If in crowded circumstances like an opening, people fell onto the board, it would have a little bit of give. And at the top it was suspended by the cables and wires. So in the end you couldn't actually really see how the boards were there with, at first glance. And that took a lot to sort of arrive at that, but it was just very important for me at that point that's how it sort of was presented. And this show went on to tour to a couple of venues in Queensland and the ACT over the following years. Just talking about the other sort of collaborators and people that are involved and help make your work happen. The commissioning process is like that too, and this is a commission that was undertaken about 8 years ago with Libby Rapal and Mark Lloyd from Coriol Winery. And they had purchased a block of land in McLaren Vale, and they were really interested in undertaking a large regeneration project with the land. It had been farmland, and I've visited recently, and it's phenomenal, the growth. This hill is now covered in vegetation. But they were really unique clients in that they were prepared to commission a work that wouldn't last forever. They were really happy to gather the materials. So all the materials came off the land that they used there. This is working with Quentin Gore, a friend and fellow artist designer, and we created these parts of the geodesic sphere and dome structure designed by Buckminster Fuller, but did it out of the local materials. So we were using local eucalyptus and fencing wire to put it together. And that, over the course of time, we've always known it won't last forever, and it has. We've been sort of going down every year or so just to check on it. And on our most recent visit, it had sort of started to really recede back into the earth. So it's I got so excited when I saw this, because this is like, the work is going to disappear soon, and that'll be the completion of the work. So yeah, to have clients that are willing to kind of invest in something that's just going to disappear is really quite special, I think. There's some other interesting, for me, work on that ephemeral sense that doesn't last, and this was the work done with Agnieszka Woźnicka and Tom Mirams on Kangaroo Island after the fires, I think around about 2007. And we were actually down there with a group of students from RISD and associates from the JamFactory doing a project, and we spent about 3 or 4 hours out in one of these burnt out, desolate fire zones. And we didn't really know what we were intending to do, and we didn't even discuss it, but somehow we just started all doing the same thing together, and it was basically collecting the white sand and gravel off the road nearby and just starting to trace the shadows. And it was an amazing amount of time where you're just walking quietly in this burnt out, blackened landscape, tracing the shadows, which then shifted by the time you'd already sort of done one tree. So that was a really, it was just one of those special kind of creative moments that you won't forget easily. In 2019, I had a similar opportunity with World Wood Day as a celebration that happens every year in a different country, and I was invited along with 10 other artists from Japan and America to go to Stubing or Graz in the Austrian Alps and spend 3 weeks there creating work for the World Wood Day, which is one specific day. And I worked with Yuri Kobayashi, who's a sculptor and furniture designer, Japanese, who's based in America. And we, similarly, we spent quite a few days in the forest together at first, just looking, wandering, gathering things. And we also didn't really discuss what we were going to do. We just started doing it. And it was, we had 3 intense weeks of creating this fairly large kind of ribbon, I guess, that just hovered on that hillside above the entrance into the Stubing Open Air Museum, ready for the open air, for the World Wood Day. And we were using some reed binding as part of it, so that it just became subtle making details if you're up close, but basically it was like a drawing on the hillside. And it was also designed just to deteriorate and fall apart in time, which it has. Let me just see it, and this is just a very short little film. There was a lot of discussion about where this would be positioned and how to keep it away from people, and it was all fragile and how to be careful of the artwork. And it went up, and within 1 hour the kids were all over it, and just wiggling it, playing bows and arrows. I love it. They just didn't care less. It was just something they found on the hillside. I've got to get off that. And now this last exhibition, Tanglewood, the third exhibition, it's not my last, it's my third, incorporates quite a, I guess it's just continuing on with this idea of using found materials, really respecting the material that I do use, enjoying the making process. And some of these pieces have been created over a few years. Bush Anatomy was actually commissioned by the university. And this Light Sticks was created for an exhibition that Gab Seto curated a few years ago. And it was still thinking about some of the processes that are involved in the forest, in the bush when you get out there, and one of the processes is that light travels down through the stems and into the roots, and it's a really fascinating part of how that kind of ecology works within the forests. And I've been very interested in that. If we walk through the bush, you have a certain impact from it. You view it in one way, and if you actually take time and start looking closer, you observe a whole, there's another world of things going on all the time, and then there's all the things that we can't observe that are taking place under the ground and between the trees, and it's just a really fascinating experience to walk into the bush, I think. This is a piece that is called Mutant, and it was taking some of those ideas and just thinking about, well, what may happen in the future if plants or trees mutate and evolve in a different way. And then, this, probably a lot of the work, if you've seen it in the exhibition, it sort of hovers on that in the area between is it found or is it made. And I kind of like that as the uncertainty that is presented there. It looks like you would have just found it, but when you look closer, that doesn't make any sense. All the branches are joined, and that's, for me, that's part of the intrigue. There's an exhibition over in the Mod Museum, just straight over the road. If anyone isn't aware of it, it's about 6 galleries. It's on for a year, called Invisibility, and I had a research project funded through the university to look at the similarities between the Great Australian Bight, the littoral zone, and also the littoral zone of the Brittany coast in France. And COVID kind of put an end to some of the things we were hoping to do, but ultimately it was really looking at how does artistic and creative kind of ways interpret scientific data. Could we look at the same things and come up with different interpretations of it? So here's some couple of shots just from the Great Australian Bight. And this work developed to work with a geology professor called Tom Raimondo, and looking at thermal heat flows under the Earth's crust that run between Antarctica and the Nullarbor Plain, and they can actually go down through the mines in the Nullarbor Plain to take thermal readings of what's taking place under Antarctica, which is such a fragile ecology. This is a much better way to sort of gather that information, and then the impact it has on climate change and warming oceans and all of our lives basically. So this is over there currently up until the end of the year. My work is the 3 very large sculptures suspended from the ceiling that are still working on this idea of plants and adapting and how things might feed themselves in the future, ideas like that. Agnieszka Woźnicka developed the animations of going down the mine shafts and then looking at the actual thin veneer slices of the geological specimens. Go over and have a look because I can't explain it all. But these are, and there's coloured filter lights as part of that exhibition, which give that sense of underwater and movement. And again, this is a huge team of people that brings exhibitions like this together. It's not just the artists involved. It's the scientists, it's the curators, the exhibition studios that actually have the expertise to present these. So many thanks to those people. Whoops, where am I going now? So the name of Tanglewood for the exhibition is, it relates to the tangled wood that you see in the show, but it also relates to my family home in the Blue Mountains, which is where a lot of my formative years were spent. And this is Wentworth Falls up in that area. So lots of time as a kid was spent up roaming around in the Jamison Valley and going down ropes on the sides of waterfalls and various things. And this is the work, current work that's in the Tanglewood show. Gondwana Blue was collected from burnt salvage materials on the western end of Kangaroo Island. And it's actually Banksia. Dark Star is a eucalyptus form that I've really started this process of just looking at the crotch forms that happen in branches and trees and thinking about that structure and how I might be able to utilise that. And with all of these works, it's rare that I actually have a clear vision of what I'm going to make when I start. It's just I'm taking an element that interests me and then it unfolds in the studio. And I love working that way. It means every time you go in the studio, it's an unknown adventure. Things change. It's very different to having a design that, okay, I know I'm going to do this and this is how I produce it. Relict, this piece has a kind of a rusted surface on it, and it will continue to change. It's got a paint with the rust built into it. Gamel gum, one of the notions within forestry is if trees, it's a bit like grafting, if trees are rubbing against each other and they rub through the bark and then they get through the Cambrian layer, they'll end up joining and fusing and growing as one. They're known as gemels, and this piece is called Gamel gum, which it's one of those ones where you look at it, it looks like, okay, it's just a weird stick you've found, but it can't actually do that. So, yeah. Arborgate, which has some reference, I guess, into some of my past work, but there's a Greek term that really talks about the good shade. I wish I could remember the term, but the good shade that you might get from somebody or something, a presence that sort of goes around it. And the thinking behind here really is that the good shade of the trees, is everything to do with wood as a material that we use from construction, in architecture, in furniture, in objects. So I've used the sort of machined processed wood as the shadow of this tree, and I've used homage to I guess dry mortars and tenon joints as the technology of the way that we can put these things together. And Yasagamba is a piece that was really driven from watching mushrooms pop up when you walk through the bush in the winter, and all this bizarre growths and things that you can stumble across in the bush. So this is sort of stemmed from that idea of things that grow out of the detritus on the forest floor. As it turns out, this is something I named after the piece, but Yasagamba is a mushroom that's grown up in the Himalayan mountains in Tibet, and it's also known as biological gold because it's just so valuable. It has medicinal properties as well as nutritional and anything else that goes along with it, and it's become a bit of a symbol of the kind of struggles of environmental issues and sustainability and economies, and while it's this wondrous thing, it's also sort of been the cause of a destruction of a whole area of the Himalayas. So, and just in the way I make things is collect these branches and sticks over a period of time, leave them around to season as long as I can, debark them, and all the time, their kind of forms are beginning to seep into my brain. And when it comes to wanting to create something, I know where I can go and collect a particular shape, and they're hard shapes to work with, but you figure out a way to get around it. And so I end up with a studio floor of a jigsaw, basically, of just elements and pieces that I'm interested in, and then put them together. And I'll cross between drawing and making these things at the same time. And just drawing in monochrome like that really helps simplify it for me, because it's, if you look at that pile of sticks on the left, it gets complex. It's a bit crazy. So it's nice to be able to sort of simplify it down in graphic terms sometimes. And these are pieces being constructed that are over in the Mod Museum. Give you, it's quite a process putting these things together, jigging them all up just to sort of keep them in space allocated where you want as you actually join them up. The painting process is really interesting too, because you finish something and then start painting and it transforms it. And I'll paint like 5 or 6 different layers of colour on the one piece, and it's a different, it gives off a totally different read every time you work into the studio. So they're just studio shots, and that's the last shot of the last piece I made in the workshop, in the exhibition, sorry. And I've always found that the last piece in a body of work is kind of a good point to start off for the next body of work. So I keep swallow that. So I don't know where that'll go, but that's where I ended up. So that's the end. Thank you very much.